Thank you so much, Rudolph. That was so kind of you. It's really, really lovely to be here. Thank you all for taking some time out of your schedule to be here. It's also very special that the lunettes are open, apparently. I haven't experienced them before, so it's nice to see that. As well. It's been a while since I've been back at the University of Miami, and it's really a pleasure to be here. And I just want to congratulate you on your search that produced my friend Rudolph. I think that you're extraordinarily lucky to have him here. I'm sure that you've already been charmed by him in the way that I have been. He is among the most gracious hosts and wonderful interlocutors I've experienced in my career. So it's lovely to see you again, Rudy. About the Office for Urbanization, we are at the GSD having just announced the formation of this new research unit, embarking on our first project. This is a multi-year research project on the topic of South Florida and sea level, in which Miami Beach is our first case study. So over the course of the next 2 years, we'll have faculty and student teams here on a regular basis. We're opening tomorrow the first of a series of events. We'll have a colloquium at the Wolfsonian tomorrow, 10 a.m. to 6 p.m. You and your students and your faculty colleagues are more than welcome to join us there. It's not an open to the public event, it's a professional and scholarly event to gather local knowledge on the question of sea level rise and the city's response to it. In the spring of 2017, a year from now, we'll have an event at Harvard to gather Harvard, MIT, Cambridge expertise. And then in the fall of 17, we'll have a public event on Miami Beach that you'll be invited to, where we'll share with you some of our findings. But we're convinced that for a whole variety of reasons, there's no more compelling example of the correlation between storm event, sea level rise, and municipal response than Miami Beach. There's obviously a lot of intelligence in the room on that subject, and I'm looking forward to conversations with you about that going forward. So what I've prepared for you this evening is a bit of a survey, a bit of a sampler of my most recent book project. The goal of the book has been to put in place something of a monograph, as the discourse around landscape urbanism has overwhelmingly been pursued through journal articles, conferences, publications that have a certain kind of ephemeral quality. My goal has been, if not to give the last word, at least to consolidate what we think we know about this new field and to put it together in a monograph form. The book has a couple of very, very simple claims. The first of those three claims is that the landscape architect is the urbanist of our age. That's a broad claim. I'm willing to back that up. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. The second claim is that landscape urbanism, as it's been known in the last 15 years or so, is really the third such manifestation in the last 2 centuries, that in the context of rapidly changing industrial economy, at 3 moments since the 19th century, landscape has been deployed or called upon in a way to form a kind of surrogate urbanism at moments when changes in the industrial economy were too drastic, too rapid, for architecture as the primary metaphor of the city. As the industrial economy changes and the environmental and social and cultural context changes very, very rapidly, landscape has often been called upon, and I view this as a structural relationship. It's not just landscape urbanism. It began in the 19th century with the invention of the field of landscape architecture itself, responding to the industrial city. It continued in the 20th century with the development of landscape and ecological planning in response to the decentralization of the mature Fordist economy, and it continues apace today under the guise of landscape urbanism relative to post-Fordist economies of destination tourism, recreation, leisure, and the like. The book is organized in a rough reverse chronology, and it samples a variety of sites and subjects. For those of you that are more classically trained, you may find it a little too promiscuous for your liking. Having said that, I do think that we're going to be able to hopefully support the claims in the book, and also to situate landscape as something that really I think has been misunderstood. As as a native Floridian, as an architect, when I was first introduced to landscape architecture, I was led it had to do something to do with plants. I was told, don't talk to those people. Like, look at the footwear that they're wearing. This is really not about culture. And it was in that context that I first began to be curious about what this field was. And I now believe that we've come to a fundamental misrecognition in the end. Ultimately, I claim that landscape has always been urban. It's fundamentally urban by definition. I'll try to support that in a minute. The epigraph of the book is this from Mies, middle of the 1950s. There are, in fact, no cities anymore. It just goes on like a forest. So on one level, we're dealing with the metaphor of the city as itself an organic process. And I use, as a frontispiece to the book, Hilbersheimer's drawings through Alfred Caldwell of the decentralization of the mature city in the middle of the 20th century. One way of entering this story is to begin with claims over the past 10 or 15 years. So Stan Allen's formulation, increasingly landscape is emerging as a model for urbanism, has been quite well established over the course of the last 10 or 15 years. It's by now conventional. That really began in a fairly unlikely place in which a group of architects and urbanists, mostly Europeans, educated at a particular time in London or on the continent, began to look at the American city. And as they did, they were interested in questions of indeterminacy, open-endedness, and they began to see in their interest in program the potential for a new understanding of the city as understood through event and activity. Right? If you were an architect who were interested to avoid the style wars in the 1970s and 80s, right? If you wanted to maintain an interest in the city but not be bogged down by questions of style, you might, like Rem Koolhaas or Bernard Tschumi, become interested in event or program. And in that context, their interest in event or program found in the natural world, or ecology, a model for change over time that could be an analog to thinking about the city as the relationship of subjects, as the friction of bodies, as a set of social or human relationships, more so than buildings as collections. That generation had a great deal of impact on the first generation of landscape urbanists. So I'm thinking here now of landscape architects who were immersed in both natural ecology through their education in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, but who also got access to design culture. This is a project by Adrian Heus. His firm is called West 8 out of Rotterdam. His project, the Shell Project, is a good indicator of this early interest in the 1980s and 90s, in which landscape architects began to hybridize an interest in natural systems or ecology with the idea of indeterminacy and open-endedness found in fashion-forward or leading design culture. In this regard, even though Adrian was trained at the Dutch natural landscape school in Wageningen, he isn't using ecology here as a redemptive measure. He's not putting something back to a natural condition. He's using found materials and found relationships between species and their habitat so as to build environments through which they're essentially curating ecologies. And so by the time of the late 90s, you could talk about curating ecology and using ecology as an element of design in a way that the now mature or canonical works of landscape urbanism, such as the Downsview Park competition from 2001. This is Stan Allen and Jim Corner's collaborative project for that. We now look to as essentially curating species. And so this shift away from a kind of redemptive natural sciences idea about ecology toward ecology as an operating system is fundamental, and it's one basic element, one basic ingredient for understanding landscape urbanism today. Rudolph mentioned Chris Reed's Stoss Landscape Urbanism out of Boston. This is a Stoss Landscape Urbanism diagram of the Toronto waterfront. So when they were given the opportunity to compete for a major new urban district on Toronto's waterfront, they began with the study of fish. They described the project as building first a sex park for fish in which the keystone species, these fish are meant to be happy and to frolic, and by engineering up out of those species relationships, certain environments, certain habitats, Stoss and their team argued for a new relationship between city form and ecological process. Right? So I'm fast forwarding very quickly through some of the early claims around landscape urbanism, but what I want to suggest that today, in the last 5 years, increasingly in my travels, whether it's here or in Europe or in Asia, I find that disproportionately the landscape architect is operating in this mode as urbanist, delivering what had been the remit of traditional urban planning or urban designers, but beginning not with historic precedent, not with an analysis of the existing city, not with built form, rather beginning with ecological function as the foundational element of urban district making. There's much more to be said on that. Having said that, I do want to situate more fully this reception of the understanding of ecology with respect to architectural ideas of indeterminacy and open-endedness. Of course, the Koolhaas quote from the mid-90s, which is now kind of over-represented, is central here in the sense that in lieu of the fantasies of urban order and omnipotence, Koolhaas is arguing for the staging of uncertainty, the idea of infrastructure staging future possibilities, thinking again about program. And in this regard, OMA's commissions through the 1980s, in this case 86, 87, the Milan Senart Newtown competition in France would be indicative. That body of work broadly in looking at indeterminacy and open-endedness was drawing upon a longer tradition of avant-garde practices in the arts. This is just, for example, Marcel Duchamp's 3 standard stoppages. And of course, again, referencing Stan Allen's work in the 1990s, Stan was among the architect urbanists looking for models in the natural world. So these are all very early days, but what we see is a group of architect urbanists in the 80s and 90s identifying in the natural world models of change over time that they think might allow for cities to be more resilient, more flexible, more open-ended vis-a-vis program than the more traditional architectonic models might allow. Of course, at the same moment, and a little bit earlier in the 1980s, we have these other traditions of indeterminacy, of course, Marias and Pinos and frottage rubbing, whether it was Igualada Cemetery or the archery range in Barcelona, in which the plan figure comes not out of the conception of connoisseurship or shape culture, but rather through the frottage of rubbing and the finding of lines and the finding of figure. And then more recently, you might look at Foreign Office Architects' Yokohama Pier Terminal project, similarly, in which although it's an algorithm in lieu of rubbing, you see that the computer algorithm and the performativity of certain surfaces is being used to produce a highly indeterminate set of formal outcomes. In this case, the Barcelona amphitheater more recently is another good example of this, in which landscapes are being configured so as to be performatively based as opposed to being formally based. In this genre of work, there are 2 projects that I think that have been underreported that I think are quite important intellectually, if not other ways. The first is this project by Jim Corner, Field Operations, from a couple of years ago. This is for a section of the Delaware River waterfront called Bridesburg, just outside of Philadelphia. And it's a project in which, setting aside the rest of its urban proposition, Jim is proposing that phytoremediation be used, that is, sacrificial plant material be used to absorb toxins on this formerly industrial site. In that context, the traditional habit of paving over and concreting over the most toxic places is now transferred in lieu of making the places that are the most toxic to be cleaned for the longest period of time. And so you see these lozenge-shaped figures, the public realm, these public parks and open spaces are really the residue of the plumes of toxicity having been cleaned over successive iterations, successive plantations of phytoremediation. So this is a good example, I think, of that idea of the figure of the public realm coming not from precedent, not from the shape of the urban fabric, but rather from a natural process, in this case, industrial processes, their plumes in relationship to phytoremediation strategies. Another comparable project that I think is really an important kind of benchmark here is the project that Adrian Heus West 8 did for the Dutch coast, looking at the buckthorn plant. So this is for a new town settlement on the Dutch coast, a new polder being built, and you can see here in a series of diagrams the idea of allowing natural sedimentation, the dumping of dredge and the natural sedimentation processes to take place over a number of years, and that rather than the civil engineering deciding the configuration of this urban form, but rather the consolidation of soil by the roots of the buckthorn plant would be allowed over a period of time. So in both cases, we have species, phytoremediation for Corner, the buckthorn plant for West 8, but in this instance, the species and their relationship to these processes are ultimately dictating the overall morphology or configuration of the urban form, in which street width, building height, building setbacks are otherwise given by precedent, but after the fact, after the consolidation of the urban figure. Most of that is by now quite settled case law, and I don't present it to you as new, but it's an important, I think, foundation for the next piece of the argument. I think that for certain moments in the last 10 or 15 years, there has been the danger that I think these ideas have been presented and received in a context that was on the one hand perceived to be partisan. You know, I think in a part of the project of the book is to step back from some of those partisan debates in the last couple of years and to argue for something that's maybe more durable, maybe intellectually more probative as an argument for this body of material. At the same moment, I think there's been a danger in the last 10, 15 years at certain quarters that landscape just became fashionable, and that's also not very productive, ultimately relative to the kinds of challenges that we faced. And so it's in that context that I focus the middle section of the book in looking to these broader structural underpinnings of why landscape would emerge in the configuration that it has. And in this regard, I'm interested in Ken Frampton's idea of the megalopolis as a new set of historical facts. I'm also interested in the work of David Harvey, less so his prescription, but more his diagnostic tools, right? Harvey's economic analysis of cultural change in architecture I've always found quite compelling. And so in that regard, I'm interested to make a structural argument for how landscape has been formulated over the recent past and to try to build a slightly more durable history for explaining how it's occurred. Over the course of the last 10, 15 years, we've seen a range of projects like this. This is Alex Wall's diagrams of Manhattan, and in the back of house space, the infrastructure space, the logistics landscape that supports Manhattan. With images like this is Alan Berger's photographs of ports. This is Long Beach in California. Or the more recent port developments we see around the world. This is Shenzhen, Longgang City and the Qinghai port. This is James Corner field operations. We see, of course, the port has been a central venue for the debates around landscape urbanism. Ultimately, if the intellectual origins of landscape came in part out of the study of natural environment, and if in fact the strengths of 20th century landscape planning included the development of regional study of ecology, one of our challenges today is that we really lack the political and economic context in which to intervene at the scale of the region, right? And this is in fact a part of the relative failures of 20th century ecological or landscape planning was that while it used the region as its analytical frame and frame of reference, it really failed to ultimately cultivate the political and economic means to develop work at that scale. And that's a broad statement, but certainly across North America that tends to be true. In lieu of that, what we see in landscape urbanism is the development of regional understandings of ecological function and process, in which the region is still a coherent unit of study for the natural environment, but the scale of intervention is the project scale. The scale of intervention is the scale of the abandoned site of industry having left, and disproportionately these are port sites around waterfronts, among other things. In this regard, whether it's the Fritz Palmboom's plan for Eiberg, or whether it's West 8's project for Borneo-Sporenberg, we see a group of landscape architects here who are deeply immersed in port work. And in port work, they find the surface of the port a malleable surface for thinking about ecology, but equally for thinking about urban form. And that ultimately, whether it's the spectacle of events at the Schauberg Plain or Adrian's work at Borneo and Sporenberg, the landscape urbanist emerges at this point in time as responsible not only for the ecology of the water body itself in the wake of industry, but equally for the coherent configuration of events on the surfaces left in the wake of that abandonment, but equally for the urban form that will occupy after some time. I think Stan Allen's work for the Barcelona logistical activity zone was indicative, as was James Corner's work on Greenpoint, Long Island as well, in which the port surface became a staging ground for precisely that kind of indeterminacy. Ultimately, my argument in this piece of the book is that changes in industrial economy that occur quite rapidly ultimately have a very difficult time translating themselves immediately through architectonic models of urban form. And that in response to those shocks, whether it was in the 19th century or in the middle of the 20th century or today, changes of industrial economy that produce disruptions in the spatial pattern ultimately draw upon landscape. They rely upon landscape as both a balm to the wounds of industry and industrial change, but equally as a medium in which to build coherent, more healthful public realms in the context of social and environmental disruption. There's more to be said about that in other contexts. In this section of the book, I connect the arguments about economic change to a deeper history or origin myth about where landscape comes from. And this, and then the final section of the book, are really both origin myths about what landscape is and what it means and how we might think about it today. I think, among other things, this quote from Christopher Wood's book on Albrecht Altdorf from the 90s has really stuck with me. Wood argued, I think very clearly, that landscape in the West was a symptom of modern loss. It's a form that emerged only after our relationship to nature had been disrupted by urbanism, commerce, and technology. And so this is a piece of the book and the concluding chapters of the book where I argue that we've somehow been led to believe that landscape is an exception to the city, that it's outside of the urban or somehow meant to be a response to. And I think that while I understand how we got to that place historically, I think it's not very productive for us today. And rather, revisiting the origin of landscape itself, first as a genre of painting, then a genre of theatrical arts, there might be a better way to construct that history for us today. This, in a way, is a bit of a return to an old narrative, and there are aspects of this narrative that you'll find quite familiar, if not reassuring. The basic claim here is that landscape in its etymology and its origin myth in the West comes very specifically from two places associated with the most advanced mercantile economy in Western Europe, in the Po River Valley and in Flanders. It emerges not out of a response to the pastoral or to the countryside, but rather precisely in the industrial economy that produced the Renaissance, among other things. At the same moment, my claim in the book is that landscape began not as the depiction of the urban or the pastoral, but landscape emerged in the West through the depiction of the formerly urban. Landscape emerged as the depiction of the abandoned urban territory. Of course, for those of you that have followed my work, I've used Detroit often as a way to tell this story, as Detroit is maybe the clearest example we have in the history of North American urbanism of the abandonment of a city in which over half the population decamped over the course of 50 years. Of course, Rome and Rome's abandonment is maybe the story in the West about depopulation, whereas Detroit lost half of its population over the course of half a century. Of course, Rome lost millions of population and shrunk to a tiny nut within its shell, according to Krauthammer, among other chroniclers. Even by the time of Noli's drawing, you begin to see the way in which the urban figure sits within the Aurelian wall circuit. And in this regard, we're interested in the piece of territory within the Aurelian wall circuit that is still no longer urbanized. Even in the context of counter-Reformation reurbanization, this interior hinterland, which came to be known by the name disabitato in Italian, was disproportionately the venue that Italian painters used to depict what came to be understood as landscape by English consumers of the topic. In this regard, what I want to say here has to do with a number of different figures. We have to understand that landscape emerges first as a genre of painting associated with the drawing of backgrounds and the representation of backgrounds in other figurative paintings and other allegorical narrative paintings. And that certain practitioners of this art take landscape into the foreground. I'm showing you here the work of Claude Lorraine, among others associated with the origins of landscape painting. What Claude would do in this drawing, you can see his own habit of going into the field to make sketches from in plein air, from nature, often guarded, as he was here in this image, with an armed guard, because the disabitato was a bit of a sketchy territory. It was a place that had at various moments fallen into lawlessness and was essentially given over to a combination of wild abandonment, so succession strategies, right? They found over 480 varieties of plant and seeds in the Flavian amphitheater, the Colosseum, among other places, but also to cultivation, as this was the rapidly growing suburban home to the Curia, the papacy, and Rome's elites. In drawings and paintings such as these, Lorraine depicted a disabitato that was both subject to a millennium of succession processes, its own natural forces, but began to be cultivated in a new way. And in studies like this, credible ink wash drawing of an oak tree on the Villa Madama, Lorraine, among others, popularized what came to be understood as landscape in the West. So what for Lorraine was essentially the depiction of the formerly urban or the abandoned urban territory, that came to be codified in a century of landscape painting and then migrated into the visual and theatrical arts more broadly. A century later came to be a mode of human subjectivity. So that by the 17th century in England or the 18th century in England, you could be said to have a landscape experience. And if you couldn't afford to go on the grand tour, you might actually be able to go to the Lake District and rehearse a tour not dissimilar from that. You might actually, if you had other means, be able to reorganize your estate by the late 17th or into the 18th century so as to more emulate Claude's paintings, right? So we have a transmission from painting into human subjectivity through a range of arts, and ultimately into the built world through the reconfiguration of estates and then ultimately public parks and gardens, in which landscape comes to be disproportionately influenced in the West, in the Anglo tradition in particular, with the depiction of the formerly urban. One interesting device here, I showed you the frontispiece image from Lorraine's Liber Veritatis Book of Truth, which was like a kind of copyright sketchbook he made to verify his own paintings. You can see that it's made in a dark convex mirror. Of course, a century later, Gainsborough and others would comment on the use of the so-called Claude glass, the use of the dark convex mirror, which became a touristic device. If you were going on the tour, if you were going to the monuments in Rome, or if you're going to the Lake District, or even to your own property, you were meant to turn your back to the view and to gaze into this Claude mirror. And the Claude mirror had the effect of condensing the view, changing the coloration, so as to more closely emulate Claude's paintings of abandoned Rome, right? So the transmission here is not simple, but at the same moment, it's been quite well codified in the art historical literature that we have available. The only other thing that I'll say on that has to do with the disproportionate reception of this by the British connoisseur. Whereas the oil paintings were, of course, collected by the papacy, by the curia, by the princes and the elites, the nobles of Europe, and they reside overwhelmingly in those collections. If you look at the British holdings, disproportionately British collectors and then ultimately British institutions, the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford or the British Museum itself, they hold the collections of these nature studies, these drawings from nature, and that disproportionately influenced taste culture around the formation of what came to be known as landscape gardening in England in the 18th century. Again, if you want more on that, we can point you to the work of John Dixon Hunt and the work of Dennis Cosgrove and a range of other people that have spent more time on it than I have. But for my argument for you here this evening and in this context in the book, the idea that landscape was always urban, that its origin was fundamentally about depicting the formerly urban is, I think, an important part of this larger arc to the book. Having established that landscape first emerges in the West in the depiction of the formerly urban or the urban abandoned, I then want to connect that to the role of landscape in the 20th century in response to decentralization of industrial economy. In this case, I'll use Hilbersheimer, 1949, "The structure of the city is wrong. Only a structural change could bring about the necessary order." In this context, Hilbersheimer, the German planner, colleague of Mies van der Rohe, a good Aristotelian, is interested in order in its classical Aristotelian sense, that is, each element in relationship to its fundamental set of parts, or each part in relationship to the whole. And in this context, what Hilbersheimer saw was a lack of fit between the models of industrial economy and the models of industrial order, the industrial city in North America that he witnessed between the 1930s and 1940s, and the new Fordist economy, which was rapidly decentralizing across North America. And through that, Hilbersheimer saw, I think quite rightly, that no urban project was going to overturn or resist even the structural foundations of that decentralized industrial economy. But in that structural relationship, Hilbersheimer anticipated our interest in landscape today by arguing that we really needed a landscape framework for thinking about urbanization and the decentralized industrial economy that came with it. So through a range of projects, drawings, Hilbersheimer, of course, produced the new regional pattern and a range of other proposals in which the decentralized North American industrial economy would not be resisted by the city as an architectural fragment or object, but rather would give way to a much larger, much horizontal, much more infrastructurally informed pattern. What's interesting for me here, of course, is that the version of modernist planning that I learned at Gainesville, Florida as a good undergraduate was that, of course, modernist planning failed us, right? It happened, right? Modernism died when Charles Jenks said it did with the demolition of Pruitt-Igoe. And in fact, what's dropped out of that history, was in fact the fact that Hilbersheimer and Mies built what's arguably, I think, the most successful project of public housing in the history of North America, precisely using this model of decentralization in the context of Detroit's ongoing abandonment and decay. And in fact, there's a longer history that I make reference to in the book, in which a critical position about industrial economy can be connected to a series of practices that I think of as progressive, whether it's Hilbersheimer's New Regional Pattern, or in this case, Andrea Bronzi and his associates and their projects for No Stop City, or for Agronica more recently. There is a very strong alternative or progressive tradition, I think, on the left of urbanists in which they're using new urban propositions to illustrate the very underpinnings, the very structural conditions of the industrial economies that organize our cities. These can be read as either dystopian or optimistic, depending upon your politics. I think today there's also a conversation to be had about the work of Dogma Studio and Pier Vittorio Aureli in that regard, and the relative possibility of an urbanism to be political in that sense. Well, there's much more to be said, and I think substantively in that piece of the book relative to the social inequities, the reception of the failures of modernism. The last thing that I wanted to say on that subject for you this evening is that I believe we in the design fields, we as architects and urbanists, have effectively inherited responsibility for what have been a whole range of social and political failings. That's not to suggest that modernist planning is not an incommensurate project to try to recuperate. It's a challenging one, and I want to suggest that there are limits to that recuperation. But having said that, having exhausted the semantic nightmare and the desire for a postmodern alternative, I think in many cases, we've returned now to a place where we're still grappling with some of the fundamental challenges associated with the modern metropolis. How do we deal with questions of coastal resilience, storm events, and sea level rise? How do we plan for airports and major infrastructural alignments? These are things that cannot be developed strictly out of the traditional playbook, whether it's the playbook of the street grid of neo-traditional urban planning, or if it's the set-piece idea of architecture leading alone. I think it's clearer to us today that we really need ecological and landscape inputs into our urban thinking. And so in that regard, I've been spending a little time recently looking back at the origins of landscape architecture itself. I've made this claim about landscape architects as the urbanists of our age. At the same moment, of course, we could say very clearly here this evening that the origin of planning emerged out of landscape architecture, right? The formation of landscape architecture in the second half of the 19th century on the eastern seaboard of the US was followed by a few decades by the developments of urban city and town planning, and then urban planning in the 20s and 30s and 40s, both as an academic program, ultimately as a profession. And so that DNA is quite clearly well understood here. But again, I think what's gotten lost in that transmission, as landscape architecture left its urban commitments, we ultimately found landscape architecture falling back on the trivial, on the plant material, on the decorative, on the things that were extra urban, as urban planning essentially took the urban commitments of the field away. What I found, I've been a little bit surprised to find, actually, and what I'll share with you briefly is a little bit of that origin story of the field. It begins with this note. Jeffrey Jellicoe was, among other things, the founding president of the International Federation of Landscape Architects. No less than the founding president of this august international body said as late as 1960 that the field was wrongly named. And I don't mean to get hung up just on semantics. You can tell by now I'm interested in words. I think they matter. Having said that, I don't think this is purely a semantic issue. I think what we inherit as a received history about a place or a field or a body of work matters with respect to what we think it can do today. In that regard, I was interested to ask a very naive, a very simple question about, in the formation of landscape architecture as a profession, first in the eastern seaboard of the United States in the second half of the 19th century, what was the first work of landscape architecture? Any thoughts on that? What was the first work of landscape architecture in the professional sense? What's that? Cities? Yeah. I was taught, I mean, I'm not going to call anybody out, but I was taught by well-intended tenured faculty that it was Central Park was the first professional work, right? Olmsted and Vaux, right? Wasn't that the mythology? So I spent a little time in the last couple of years looking into this. This is, of course, the 1807 Commissioner's Plan, the Bridges Plan of the Commissioner's Grid of Manhattan. And you'll notice that, of course, it's conspicuously absent as any big park in the middle. The grid stops up here at 155th Street because that's as far north as anybody could imagine urbanizing in 1807. And it's also a place where the topography gets a little bit out of hand. Among the questions I'm asking here is, given the long-standing proximity of landscape architecture and the landscape arts to gardening, and given the overwhelming reception of the British Isles, the Anglo tradition to the US, why wasn't it called landscape gardening? There had been a 2 centuries tradition in the British Isles of calling it landscape gardening. I can tell you this is, I'm told, Humphrey Repton's business card, among other things. It calls himself very proudly a landscape gardener. Perfectly serviceable cultural tradition, which I was led to believe when I was a student in architecture that was continuous. In this case, that tradition of whether it's Repton or others of importing landscape gardening to the US, I believe that historical continuity has been overstated. I think that historical continuity with the Anglo tradition has been overstated, and that has tended to obscure a much more Francophile, much more Francophone origin myth to landscape architecture, and I'll say more about that in a minute. In accepting the position to be the superintendent of the Central Park, Frederick Law Olmsted, in the 1850s, all the way through lobbying for the design competition, partnering with the best landscape gardener architect of his day, Calvert Vaux, who had apprenticed with Downing, in winning the design competition along a strictly party line vote, right? 5 good Republican reformers against 4 Democrat, boss hacks. In none of that did Olmsted ever use the term landscape architect. He called himself architect. When he won the commission, much to the chagrin of Calvert Vaux, he promoted himself to architect-in-chief. Of course, Olmsted had no training in architecture. He didn't practice as an architect, right? He was a journalist. He had, had a notable career as a kind of social crusader and journalist. He failed at farming. He failed at publishing. He was really down on his luck, and I don't want to do anything to diminish the man or his myth, but at the same moment, we have to acknowledge he took the position as superintendent as a civil service job to stay out of debt. He did so not because he was going to design the park, because he was a very nimble political operator. He very quickly consolidated the political support for this new park. And in so doing, argued for the design competition, knowing he could enter that competition and win it. And having done so, through that time, he happily operated under the term architect. It was only after his 1859 visit to Europe, having exhausted his budget and the patience of his commissioners, his board of directors essentially sent him to Europe to study European practices, the design and planning of parks and gardens, but also practices for their management. Of course, Olmsted spent 2 weeks in Paris in November of 1859, during which time he visited the Bois de Boulogne no less than 8 times. And at the Bois de Boulogne, he would see Alphonse improvements, he would see aménagement and administration, and he would see a whole range of organization of the public realm, from the design of the park down to the park police and their uniforms. And this template, this imprint, is the clearest model that he brought back from his European trip for what this new profession might be. He also saw, in the Bois de Boulogne, in the office of the landscape architect, a stamp called Service de l'Architecte Paysagiste. This was a hyphenated formulation that had been attributed to a fellow called Morel in the 1820s. And Morel had been trained as an architect, an engineer at the Pont et Chaussée, and also as a landscape gardener. And so that hyphenated combination came ultimately to Olmsted into English. It had been existing in a couple of other places in association with landscape painting, but never with the practices of design. And subsequent to his return in 1859, 1860 to the United States, Olmsted applied the term landscape architect in English to every subsequent professional commission, at first evidenced in letters from himself to his father in the early 1860. And the first commission in that regard was not for the Central Park, it was for the planning of northern Manhattan. In 1860, the commissioners for the planning of northern Manhattan, that's north of 155th Street, Washington Heights, commissioned Olmsted and Vaux, landscape architects, to commission not the design of a park, not the design of a promenade or a pleasure ground, the design of the shape of the city. Built form, block structure, street setback, and the like. So that's my origin myth for you this evening. That is, in its origin, landscape architecture was first and foremost responsible for the shape of the city, but the shape of the city not excluding these externalities, including the environmental health and the social health of the populations that benefit from it. In that context, the origin of landscape architecture as a profession, as an academic discipline in North America, that's been well rehearsed. My contribution here is to argue that it had less to do with the reception of practices of gardening from the British Isles and more to do with the transference of engineering and architectural sensibilities from Paris, and in which Olmsted ultimately argued his biggest challenge, his biggest concern about the new profession, the new art of landscape architecture, was its future disalliance from architecture. He argued very clearly in the 1860s and 70s that the pressures of science, scientific knowledge, and professional practice will be such that future landscape architects will be pressed to know more and more scientific knowledge on a range of subjects about plant material. And the real danger is that in the public eye, the public will misunderstand this new profession as something primarily to do with plants. And that those two forces, the rise of scientific knowledge on the one hand, and the public perception or misunderstanding of the field as being about plants, led Olmsted to argue for a close alliance between the new art of landscape architecture and the old art of architecture, in fact, borrowing a little bit of its cultural resonance along the way. So thanks very much for coming out this evening. It's a pleasure to be here. Look forward to chatting with you if you have questions. And as I say, I think the landscape architect is today operating as the urbanist of our age. I think given the context that we live in this world, we just saw in the New York Times today that apparently seas are rising faster today than they have for 28 centuries, among other things. That's interesting to me. Thanks. Can I take some questions? Can I? Yeah, thanks. Yeah.
Charles, that was a great talk, and I'd like to go to the moment, because Harvard, of course, the first program in landscape architecture that Harvard launched based on Eliot with the principles that you outlined exactly as you told it. One of the first graduates came to Miami, William Lyman Phillips, and he brought with him the experience as an engineer and a city planner, and he brought that to landscape architecture. In his letters, there's a moment when the profession begins to, at Harvard, the education of the landscape architect starts to split into this kind of planning and landscape split. And he and many of his colleagues from the periods when he studied argue against the split. Do you think there's the possibility of a reunification?
Thanks for it's a well-phrased question. I think we're living in an era of rapprochement, I would say. There are at least two historical moments. One that you point out in the 20s and 30s, when the professionalization of planning, as much as anything else, left landscape bereft, I think. And frankly, landscape wasn't nimble enough to stay in the game, and then became relegated to look and feel, the decorative. And then post-1968, there was another moment in which the pressures on fields in our schools, which tended to hang together more or less, collegially before then. Post-1968, schools of planning and landscape and architecture were radicalized by very, very different motivations. Schools of planning tended to be, radicalized around social questions. They tended to move away from design and toward social policy, social science, and that plus the ongoing professionalization of planning means that, if you have a proper or an esteemed planning program, you really are producing, PhD credentialed social scientists in North America. And so that left a kind of void as landscape architects were radicalized around environmental issues post-68, and architects have been radicalized around their own autonomy, frankly, and enjoying, productively, I must say so, their own cultural and disciplinary autonomy. My experience in these fields was that we were given a false choice post-68 to either pick one, right? And I think we're now at a moment of rapprochement in which at least there's a greater acknowledgement that we kind of need the stuff the other group took with them, right? Having said that, I think it's not easy to get past these histories institutionally, professionally. nor do I think the reunion looks like it used to. I think that's a little bit of the quote that I blew past from Roland Barthes about interdisciplinarity is not a comfortable affair. It's really about the friction. It's about the rumbling up, and I think language plays a role in that. I use the Barthes quote in that context to signal sometimes it gets messy and sometimes it's fashionable, and I'm sorry, but you need new discourse and sometimes to describe new practices. And I do find in my travels there is increasingly a sense that the ecological, the biological, the landscape material has a lot to offer the urban these days. Not that there aren't other things to be said there. And yet we've built these institutions to educate ourselves in particular tracks. And you don't want to change your degree nomenclature or the name of your profession every time there's a new storm. Like every time there's a new mosquito virus and a new, thing, you can't do that, right? So I understand why these things have been quasi-durable, and I do think there is a kind of settling out. And that's a bit of why I'm closing with this argument about our proximity to architecture. That for me, when landscape or planning leave design culture and think of themselves as primarily a kind of administrative art, policy art, or a scientific or technical exercise, I really get concerned at that point. I think that cities are nonlinear, complex, messy problems. I don't think we can wait for all the data. And so in that context, I'm very optimistic these days that at least we're talking to each other.
Thank you. I may be the only civil engineer in the hall, but I do a lot with green infrastructure, so I'm finding it very interesting. One of my questions is a lot of your case studies or projects that you pointed out are big.
Yep.
And if you use the analogy of landscape as healing, that often happens at a very small scale, and you see that with redevelopment, infill, that sort of thing. Where do you think landscape urbanism stands on, making small possible?
Yeah, it's well put. I think scale, I didn't realize at the beginning, that scale was as an issue as it is. And I'm now convinced that it's really an important set of questions. And where I am now is simply trying to describe disciplinary habits of mind, ways of working, rules of thumb, just to kind of try to be literate about how people work in different fields. The third most controversial thing I did as chair at Harvard was I asked all of our faculty to put together a list of the scales at which their students draw. It was remarkable. I mean, I had populated a faculty that was like 1/3 Canadian. And so the fact that I wanted to have a conversation about metric versus empirical was a part of that. That was a part of that. For me, I think that there are three places where these ideas are most relevant today. First, I'll say a disclaimer. If you're not urbanizing, I don't think you need an urban model. That is, I live in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Lovely place. I'm very lucky. It's down zone to zero. It's not going to grow. There's no increment. They're not adding anything. They don't need an urban theory, right? And so there are plenty of places in the world that don't need these ideas. If you are urbanizing, if you're changing over time, particularly rapidly, I think these ideas become more and more pressing. I think in places that are urbanizing more modestly, if they're changing more slowly or over time, I think that the traditional toolkit, the old toolkit that we've got, is probably pretty serviceable. But these tend to be useful in places that are growing very, very rapidly, places that are shrinking very, very rapidly, and places that are characterized by informality or organic processes that kind of bubble up. In each of those three areas, these ideas have gotten a foothold. And so for me, it's the rate of change over time that's maybe more indicative than absolute scale. These projects come out of a tradition in which we used to build public parks and public realm. When the commissioners of Central Park raised money, they raised money from the city and private sources, and they bought the land, right? So that was a major work of civic improvement. We don't do that much these days. What we do now is we, try to raise private funds for the High Line or the Underline, and that's a very big economic shift, but it's also a scalar shift. So we're now working on sites that are much smaller, much less connected than our operating system of ecology would suggest. A friend of mine, Christopher Haidt, does a version of this work at Rice University, and he did an interesting study looking at Houston flooding in the bayous. And he had two recommendations. He said you could do this big landscape urbanism strategy along the bayou, or if every resident in Houston would put a 2x4 around their front lawn, you could hold about the same amount of water. And so I do think there's a lot of bottom-up. I think there's a lot of grassroots work. I do find this more apt in questions of green infrastructure is getting a lot more traction in the informal and the kind of slum developments in the world. Whereas in many contexts, the regulatory environment tend not to want everybody to have their own model of ecosystem in their own backyard or front yard.
I have a question maybe about your genealogy. You started with the degree and you went. I was wondering where would you base your GA, these famous treatises, and this consideration about landscape and architecture within that geography? I've always known that in fact you were the first one who literally started linking landscape and city in the way that you discovered to capture it almost on itself. Not reorganizing what happened to urbanize before. And how much would that, is that something that is part of your discourse here?
Yeah, it's a good point. There are many, many other origin myths, and I think that the Logier line is a fecund one. The other one is the German Linnaean line, generally speaking, even before we get to Paris. And there's something to be said about the French, engineer, pont-de-chaussée tradition as well. A part of what I'm trying to do here is I'm trying to articulate landscape without going through architecture. and you can see that puts me a little bit in knots at certain moments. Also, when I was, in my own education, my own formation, we were reading a lot of Logier. We were looking at a lot of, that body of work. And it might be my own proclivities, but I also, in this work, what I'm trying to do essentially, the project of the book is there a way to describe the urban without going through architecture? And so in that regard, it's a bit of a blind spot. I think you could make an equally compelling origin myth for landscape through Logier or through pont-de-chaussée or through the Linnaean botanical traditions. I mean, they all feed in a way. But my goal has been to try to describe, is there a way of thinking about the city in which architecture is present, but it's not demonstrative or it's not dispositive. It's not the driving element. And this is a part of my own reaction to my own formation, because I was given architecture as the way to account for, and the primary tool. And I went to Detroit, my first teaching job, and I was utterly unprepared. Like, more architecture is not going to help. And so I've become interested in places where architecture reaches its limits. The limits of architecture is an essay that I'm writing just now about when does architecture cease to be a dominant or a unifying piece. And the piece I'm writing just now is about when did we decide to start calling things design, right? So I work in a school of design, and I'm writing a little bit about that and why was architecture not sufficient, for that. And so there are a couple of myths out there that are intriguing and interesting that from an architectural culture point of view look to, but I would probably be avoiding them out of just a kind of desire to not work through architecture. Is that fair? I think that's true.
I have a question about, you really didn't mention, but I know it's a big part of the development of the city, is agricultural reform. So many cities, particularly here, start as agricultural land and develop the form of the city from agriculture. And so I wonder how does agriculture fit into that discussion? Because also the landscape urbanism oftentimes engages that as a solution.
Yeah, there's a section of the book I didn't talk about which deals with agrarian urbanism, for lack of a better formulation. And a part of that piece looks at why is there this binary? How did we get to the dichotomy? And are there ways of thinking that don't say there's city here and hinterland there? That's not what you said, but I think recent contemporary interest in urban agriculture is one layer to that. And so what I try to do is I try to look at examples, not so much where the agricultural palimpsest informed the urban shape, the urban form, which is interesting, but more, are there ways of thinking about the city that don't put the biological out there, right? So I think of the agricultural as one element within a range of biological functions. And like many of my colleagues will tell you that the most sustainable urban form is Manhattan. And I say, well, until you want milk, and then it gets really complicated, right? I mean, what's in the model and what's not is the question, right? If you're still looking at, ridership of transit and energy, electricity, then okay, maybe, but, how do you have the metabolism of that city absent all of the agricultural hinterland? There's a colleague of mine, Neil Brenner, who I, conspired with Michael Hayes and Mosen to bring to the school, who's really coming from urban theory. He's a Lefebvrean, and he's working on a project of planetary urbanism. He believes that urbanization is such now that there's no part of the planet that's not urbanized, and to think that there's a distinction between the urban and the non-urban is itself a kind of intellectual problem. So that's one piece of it. And what I try to bring to that conversation is the idea that there are models in which agricultural production can not only be incorporated in the city, but can provide a model and a metaphor for the city, whether it's Andrea Bronzi's work or Hilbersheimer's work. It's less the shape of the city in relationship to agricultural practices. It's more the idea that the agricultural practices are themselves urban. And the commingling of population with that urbanity, with that agricultural production, what does that look like? What shape does it take? It's a little bit the reverse of the Toronto waterfront, where it's not just the biology of our waste and the species, but it's the productive end of that. So I do think that there's a central story here for agriculture. I didn't do enough on it this evening. Hey. Well, I like the Jellicoe quote because of its ambivalence. And so I don't want to use that. I don't want to say that myself. It's not, and I want to, I want to problematize that question. Not because it's just about naming, but I think naming matters vis-a-vis what we think it's meant to do. A part of this is also meaning to disentangle and articulate, well, what's landscape urbanism relative to the profession, right? So landscape urbanism, I argue, is a series of practices. It's discourse. It's a series of practices. It's things you can do. And as Rodolphe mentioned, there are places that have degree programs and professional titles and this like. But I don't think necessarily that we should be naming a new profession every time we have a new problem to solve. So for me, I would rather us be more conservative about the naming of everything and kind of slow down the rush to specialization, and talk more about getting architects and urban designers and planners a set of biological tools, let's say, a sensibility about and some tools to use. So, for example, in my role at the GSD, it's not that we renamed things. I mean, we're training landscape architects, but we changed the intake so that 51% of our incoming students were architects first, for example. So it's more about the DNA, and a part of what I was arguing for was we need to make it a safe place to be both. I'm all about hybridity and mixity and non-binary, right? I don't want to have to be an architect or a landscape architect. I want to be fluid in the middle of the spectrum, right? And so in that regard, it's less for me renaming the profession. It's how do we position the profession to be relevant? So for me, 15 years ago, maybe it became clear that landscape architecture was going to be the center of debates about the city. And it wasn't clear that the field was up to it. I mean, intellectually, professionally, it had a lot of work to do. There's still a lot of work to be done. So I'm not arguing for changing the name, but I do think we should spend a little time to figure out what we expect it to do, so as to make it more relevant for what we're doing today. Please.
Why is your new office for urbanization?
How much time? I don't know if you have dinner plans, but I.
It can have a very positive and very negative connotation these days.
Yeah. I have the short version and I have the 15-minute version for later. So this is a research unit. It's doing sponsored, applied design research projects. So sponsored means funded, paid for. Research means it's not teaching. Design means it's not policy or social science. That's something that many of you engage in, certainly we've engaged in for some time. The office is meant to make that more sustainable, to be slightly clearer about our internal working processes so that each of these initiatives is not one faculty doing it and then another faculty doing their own thing, because that is productive, but we wanted to do something slightly more institutional. Office, because all of the other euphemisms, frankly, are, I think, a little stale. Like we've seen enough centers and initiatives and, God, institutes, my tendency is to just make it as less pretentious as possible. And so office, there's a kind of practicality, like is that like Office of Payroll Services or Offices of HVAC? Like there's meant to be something practical about that. Urbanization is a little bit, wanting to engage with those forces, I would say. Whereas urbanism, of course, you guys know this, right? So urbanism is the kind of continental French as much as anything else, the city and the study of, right? So urbanism is a department or a professor in which you can both do the study of but also intervene upon. And that's a nuance that is not available to us in English in the same way, and that's why we've adopted urbanism for this movement and a couple of other things, because it avoids the Anglo split between the study of and the intervention upon, right? Having said that, urbanism is also, it's ubiquitous these days. Like I've been doing it for a while, my colleagues have been doing it for a while. Whereas urbanization makes it slightly more pointed, a little bit more urgent, a little bit more like this is processes that are happening now that we're not in charge of. Last word, urbanism is the disciplinary formation, right? What we say about it as a field, urbanization are the forces that are outside of us.
So, this is very dense. I'm still absorbing the material, and a lot of it is new to me. Are you then retreating from the position, which I actually maybe hyperbolically stated in my intro? I said that your work led to the creation of a new field, it opened up a new space, academic departments, but also in practice. So, are you? And I remember in the early days of landscape urbanism, the critique was coming from landscape was that, but what landscape urbanism is describing is really landscape. So are you adjusting the trajectory?
Two things we're doing. So I think it's true what you said in your intro, and I've also said it, and it's in print, that hopefully, and if you have an impact, your work changes the field of study. So absolutely, changes the field. For the first 5 years, I was using the term disciplinary realignment. And people read that as, it's a new discipline. But in fact, I wouldn't claim it as a new discipline. I think it's a new field of study. I think it's a new area of study. At the same moment, we've gone through the phases of, a revolution where initially they couldn't see us from landscape. We weren't even visible. And then immediately it was, that's really coming from architecture. And then it was, then they're a threat, so we'll make fun of it. And then it was hostilities, and now we're in, right? And in that trajectory, what I say is that, there may have been an origin myth in there that was serviceable to where we are today, but nobody found it. Landscape architecture didn't, produce it. It required this new discourse. And that's why I start with the Barth quote, because it's not that the discourse is trivial. It's not that the words are just bubbling up of their own accord. The words are contentious. They're meant to be, debated about. And so in that regard, my recommendations these days are to hybridize, build new programs, and find the language that's most relevant. And I do think landscape is relevant in a lot of places. At the same moment, I don't think that we should, have a new professional title or a new degree that's accredited to get a license in this new, because I think the hyper-specialization hasn't really helped us. And so in that regard, I understand how it may sound contradictory, but on the one hand, I'm arguing for a despecialization or a hybridity in which I think that these matters are really fundamentally vital, and in which rather than specializing and taking them away from architecture, urban design, urban planning, we actually need to be infusing them as discourses, as practices within the training of the architect and the urbanist.
Anyone else? Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.